Hi, everyone, and welcome to the panel room for our discussion of Victorian Gothic media. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. There may or may not be spoilers in this panel for various television shows, movies, or books. Now, granted, most of these have been out a while, so we're not going to censor what we say in order to avoid spoilers. But if there is something that starts to come up and you want to wait to hear that part, mute it or come back and watch the rest of the panel when you've had a chance to finish what you wanted to see. So with that, we'll start with everyone briefly introducing themselves and tell us what the term Victorian Gothic means to you. Bebe, will you start?
Sure. Bebe Bayliss. I write sci-fi, horror. I co-write with Gini Koch, also present. Victorian Gothic. I'm focused like a laser beam for reasons that I'll explain in a while on Penny Dreadful. But I think there's a sense of impending doom, great costumes, hopefully some not awful to look at people, and also some very awful to look at people, and ripping yarns and adventures. And so obviously that's quite a large tent I've put Victorian Gothic under. I must admit I read more than watch, but again, Penny Dreadful, I do have a little slice of expertise in that I'll explain.
Okay. Carole.
Hi, I'm Carole Stokes. I'm a frequent panelist on continual panels across the board. I'm the co-host of a podcast called So Get This, Lore of Supernatural Fan Fiction, and an MM romance. Victorian Gothic, I love. It's moody, it's dark, it's gorgeous. We have like gorgeous rooms, gorgeous castles, gorgeous costumes. I love all of that. There's an interesting dichotomy of we have a predilection towards the occulty things, seances, ghosts, things like that. Yet there is a quasi, not anymore, but to them it was modern in terms of equipment and machinery. And this is where we start getting some of the steampunk things going on. So you have kind of view of life, and yet they come together in this kind of really juicy, richly emotional and spooky conglomeration of Victoria. I eat it up with it.
Clay?
Yeah, hi, I'm Clay Griffith. I write with my wife as Clay and Susan Griffith, and we've done Victorian fantasy. Victorian Gothic, I think, is sort of in the big scheme of things, it's a combination of like three things for me. It's a setting, which means I need to have fog and gas lamps and carriages, handsome carriages, and doesn't have to be in London, but that's the sweet spot for me. Costumes, love the fashion of that period, and also manners. And I don't mean that people are polite to one another, although they generally were, even if it was fake. But the structure of society, the class system, if you will, and the clubs and the proper speech, and the improper speech of the street is interesting. But those are the things. And then, yeah, you want some vampires and werewolves and stuff like that, because that otherwise it's, Dickens, which is good too.
But not quite as fun.
Well, yeah, not Gothic.
Gini?
Hi, I'm Gini Koch. I write the Alien Catherine Kitty Cat series for dog books. I also write under a variety of other pen names and in all lengths and genres, and I co-write a variety of things with Bebe Bayliss, including our first full straight mystery, Falls Girl, which just released. And Victorian Gothic, to me, I'm kind of along the lines of Clay. It has to be in the Victorian era, period. Okay, I don't want to see a Victorian Gothic set in 1960. Okay, it's got to be set in the Victorian era. I don't care where it is, but it's going to probably be moodiest best in London. And then maybe you can get away with it in New York or one of your other big cities of the time and day. But, I find it difficult to buy a Victorian Gothic set in the Midwest, on the Kansas Plain. I'm just not going to buy it. Right. So the time frame for me is huge. And then Gothic covers a lot of what Carole was saying. It's got to have some dark elements. There's, somebody needs to feel like they could be in peril, real peril, clutch my pearls, peril, and yet still
hold
manage
the candelabra closely.
Yes, holding the candelabra, right? There has to be some kind of peril. There has to become some kind of darkness. Anytime I hear the term Victorian Gothic, the first thing I think of is Jack the Ripper. So that's where my mind goes. But it's set in the right time. It's incredibly Gothic. It's very frightening. Everything else, he's murdering people right and left and no one can catch him. So that to me is like your quintessential Victorian Gothic setting.
Okay. Well, those of you who've seen me on panels before know that I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I independently publish several different kinds of romance, and I write science fiction, the Outcast Station series with Jeannie Adams. I don't know much about Victorian Gothic. I have not given it a lot of thought until immediately before this panel. So I went out and did a little work with the Google. And in addition to what everybody has said, it seems like there's also often a curse or an omen. And like Clay mentioned, vampires and werewolves, there's often a supernatural or paranormal element in it. And there's usually a villain and a damsel in distress, which I think somebody mentioned. So, it's interesting to me as a subgenre because it's so popular. And so I'm hoping to learn from the panelists tonight why it's so popular. But the two things that we committed to talk about coming into this were League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and Penny Dreadful. And so we're going to talk about those and then see where the conversation takes us. So how do you think League of Extraordinary Gentlemen fits into the framework we just described? Carole, will you start?
Sure. I think right off the bat, one of the things is a lot of that modern aspect that I had mentioned, where we have new machines, we have the underwater vessel that they travel in, we have motor vehicles, we have weapons, and all of this is very modern for them. It's all new inventions, lots of inventions going on. So that's, to me, something that happens a lot in that time period. We don't so much have the moody, I feel, in League. It's much more bright. There are secrets. There is paranormal stuff going on, but it's like bright and there's a lot of action and stuff. Frankly, for me, it wasn't completely a Victorian Gothic thing to me because I missed my fog. And, there's no moors and there's no castle. There's no, some of this stuff. It was also really predominantly male. We had the one female League member. And I also had a problem because they really took things. I love Dracula. I love the actual Bram Stoker book with the journal entries and the newspaper clippings and everything. And that Mina Harker was a vampire already and all of this stuff. I had a problem with that.
Okay.
I also had a problem with Tom Swift being there. Did we just need like a handsome young man and so they threw him in?
Tom Sawyer, but yes.
Tom Sawyer, I'm sorry.
Tom Swift would have been better.
Yes, actually, Tom Swift would have been better.
See how much it threw me out of the story. So it was, the time period was right. It had a couple aspects that were good, But for me, it did not ring true as real Victorian Gothic without some of these other elements we've already been discussing.
Okay. Well, we'll go back and discuss the literary strains that the literary works that this movie draws on when we kind of deal with this general issue. Clay, how would you rate it as Victorian Gothic?
It has Gothic elements because it took characters who are from the Gothic, like Jekyll and Hyde and Invisible Man. I may be confusing sometimes the comic with the movie. I'm not a fan of the movie. In fact, I'm not sure I've sat all the way through the movie. I was a fan of the comic, Alan Moore, who's sort of this pop culture polymath who combined all these elements. And what's to me interesting about the fact that he could do it, otherwise, he's just a genius in a way, but in sort of an insane way. But the fact that he could combine all these different characters into a relatively seamless story shows how similar the Victorian adventure Gothic world is, and that we expect similar things from different characters. You can read Sherlock Holmes, you can read Dracula, you can read Tom Swift, you can read Jekyll and Hyde, and they've got enough of the same stuff in there which we crave that you can then mash them together, and it's like the Marvel universe. Everybody just piles in the same carriage. So I understand the argument that it's not Gothic because it doesn't have a lot of the traditional Gothic story beats. I mean, hell, I don't remember what the story was in the movie. I just remember them driving around in that gigantic car. And Sean Connery sort of thinking about cashing his check. And again, in the comic, the story in and of itself wasn't the important part to me. It was just the fact that all these people were kind of hanging out and being cool, and Alan Moore can do that, like with Watchmen. That's just his thing. But it does show, I'm again, just to be repetitive, it shows how the expectations of Victorian adventure and Victorian Gothic share so much of the same elements because all these disparate characters can be made to work together, and they seem like they fit together.
Jenny?
I've read the comic and I watched the movie. The comic is absolutely Victorian Gothic. It has all the Gothic elements in it. There's a lot of creepy stuff. There's way more going on than you see in the movie. I didn't actually enjoy it. No one's likable in the comic.
Oh.
And so I didn't enjoy that. Whereas I think Watchmen's like the best graphic novel ever done and one of the best novels ever done, just in and of itself. I wasn't really wild about League. It was good, but I didn't enjoy any part of it. I kept waiting to enjoy it, and I didn't. But it has all Victorian Gothic elements in there. I enjoy League. Okay. I was homeschooling our daughter at the time. And so in order to see the movie, she had to do reading. I assigned reading from everything. So she had to read Dracula and Picture of Dorian Gray and all, Jules Verne and et cetera. Everybody that's mentioned there, she had to read, and I read it along with her. And we both came to the conclusion that her father is incorrect and Jules Verne is boring. Neither one of us could get through 20,000 Leagues. And I just said, if your mom can't read it, you don't have to. Keep moving, right? And we realized that H.G. Wells was a great idea man, but the Victorian era of writing turns it into, well, as you know, Bob, let me tell you what happened. And that was just deadly. My favorite was her book report on it about the Invisible Man. Dude discovers how to make himself invisible, spends the whole time angry and running around looking for pants. No, it's completely accurate. So the Invisible Man in film is so much better than the Invisible Man in writing. Other than the Tom Sawyer character, which Tom Sawyer would be the oldest person based on when this happened, not the youngest. I'm with, it was either Carole or Nancy. So did we just need a young dude? Yes, they just wanted a young dude. and couldn't figure out somebody else with a name as near as I can tell. I really enjoyed the movie. I liked the action. I didn't mind that it was bright. I liked that it had a different plot in many ways than the comic. But is it really Victorian Gothic? Kind of, because there's a lot of stuff going on. The shenanigans between the characters, especially Dorian, and how he's reacting with everybody, I think sort of helps put it into the Gothic. But no, there's no fog. They're on a ship for half the time, right? Shooting skeet, and everything else. So the fog, they definitely went for, we're not going to do atmosphere. We're going to do gadgets, because gadgets look super cool, right? So I don't think the movie is a brilliant gem. I enjoyed it. My daughter enjoyed it. I actually will rewatch it on occasion, but I'm looking for more of the interplay of those characters on the same screen together, which is the fun of it. But I don't know that it wants to be Victorian Gothic, and it got Victorian right and some Gothic, whereas the comic definitely got the Gothic part and the Victorian part correctly.
Okay. And Bebe?
I had never watched the movie, and definitely never read the comic, and had not watched the movie until I made myself watch it as research for Penny Dreadful. And I found it bright and sunny and chirpy and boy's own adventure. And to me, it was more Tom Brown's School Days meets Ripping Yarns than it was either. So Victorian, maybe by timeline, Gothic, not a bit. I mean, I think it had more to do. It shared more DNA with Briscoe County Jr. for that. It was gadgets. It was guys having adventures. So it was a timeline thing. But and were they extraordinary and were they gentlemen? Maybe. So yes. So as I said, not my area of expertise, or apparently even interest, now that I hear myself speak about this. Sorry.
That's okay. Well, let's talk about the literary influences of that movie or story. So if everybody could pick one thing to start off with that you found effective or not effective in the way they drew on the underlying literature, that would be great. And share that with us. Clay, will you start?
Well, as I said, since I never quite made it all the way through, the thing I remember, and from the comic as well, I'm a big fan of Alan Quatermain. Not Victorian Gothic by any stretch, but Victorian, and Edwardian too. I love Haggard's novels, some of them are same old, because he made a lot of money writing them, so he wrote one frequently. But the Sean Connery as the aging Alan Quatermain, Connery could have played, I think, a really good Alan Quatermain, again, to me, in a good movie. I think it would have been really interesting to see him do like a King Solomon's Mines or something, or there's a book called Alan Quatermain, which is my favorite. Would have been great. I'm not sure you can do Alan Quatermain anymore. I think those days are past. It's difficult still to do Tarzan. They keep trying, but it becomes harder and harder each time, and justifiably so. These are historical documents that probably don't need to be consistently revived, because in order to make them palatable, they're no longer what they were. And Alan Quatermain, to make him palatable, is no longer Alan Quatermain. But I wish he'd been treated better than sort of turning him into a drug addict. But that he was kind of a drug addict, so what are you going to do?
Jenny, what was either particularly effective or particularly ineffective for you for the way they drew on the literary influences?
Well, again, remember, I was using this as a homeschooling tool, so it was great. My daughter fell in love with Dorian Gray, and therefore Oscar Wilde. She fell in love with Dracula, and therefore Bram Stoker. She fell madly in love with Alan Quatermain, and therefore read all of Haggard's novels. so on and so forth. So, we read Jekyll and Hyde and all the others. And so it really gave her a love of the era of reading. Not all of it, because both of us felt, well, so we could just leave it alone. I really have two, but I'll only do one right now. I really liked how they did Dorian Gray, because Dorian is an asshole in the book and in the movie. He is not a nice person. What he is a very pretty person. And he gets away with everything because of that. And that is shown in the movie. So I thought they did a really good take on Dorian Gray, both with the actor they chose and how they depicted him, because that guy is not nice. He is not a nice person. There is nothing nice about Dorian Gray. And his picture shows it. Right? So he is definitely someone who I think makes a very good villain, because part of you is hoping he's not a villain because he's so darn pretty, but he is. And he is shown to be quite the villain in both the book and the movies. So I thought they did a really good job with how they moved him in and how they had him be.
And Bebe?
I've read a lot of Victorian stuff. I mean, that was my go-to for a long time. If it had been published in the 20th century, I almost didn't read it. Okay. So it's hard for me to divorce my love of Brontes and, that whole era of, Robert Louis Stevenson and Treasure Island and Boys' Adventures. It's hard for me to translate that into what happened on the screen. Again, Briscoe County Jr. has more DNA and from a, which I don't think has a literary background. So when I watched the film, I wasn't hearkening back to any of the literary influences, because it just seemed like they plucked names and sort of sketchy backgrounds for people enough to sell it to someone. I mean, I would imagine the pitch was like something out of that movie, The Player. Okay, what if the hero from Solomon's Mines meets up with a guy that was a vampire killer, and then we put them in Captain Nemo's really, really bitchin'. We're going to spend all of the money. You're going to see every dollar on the screen because Nemo's craft is amazing. It all felt cobbled together to me. So I stopped paying attention to the story and just watched the pretty pictures. And from an art direction point of view, I thought it was pretty epic. Okay. Which was not answering the question at all, but there you go.
Let me also say that the actual pitch was, hey, this was done by Alan Moore and we got it dirt cheap. Let's make it.
Oh, there you go.
Carole?
Well, for me, I'm going to go back to again. There's a lot of good characters in Dracula, and hey, you have Dracula himself, and instead they, it's like Bebe said, where they just threw something. We got to have a vampire. Well, let's do Dracula, but no, we need a woman in there, so we'll make it be, we'll take Mina Harper, and we'll just completely negate her entire storyline. And, how she fought against being a vampire. And instead, we'll just make her a vampire. And so she's going to have all these extra skills, but she's going to be hot. She's going to be a hot blonde. So everybody's going to be fussing over her. And then we'll have a little love triangle going on. And it was abysmal for me. It was they just didn't, the only thing they took was the name and that it was somebody in Dracula. And that was it. They completely divorced it from the actual source material, which just, I completely concur with the whole cobbled together, let's just throw this in there and that and then, oh, and hey, how about...
Well, I was an undergraduate history major, and I did not take literature, and I did not read Victorian literature because I was scarred by Far From the Madding Crowd in high school. So, no, not going there. So what you all have had to say has been really interesting. Is there anything that anybody would want to add to that before we move on?
I do.
Yeah, Gini.
As the only person who liked the movie, literally, I'm the only one in the group. I didn't mind what they did with Mina. I didn't mind any of the stuff because this is clearly taking them out. This is a different thing. If you didn't like the movie, there's certain things you will not enjoy in the comic, let me tell you. Because Moore does whatever he wants, because these are all characters in public domain when he does it, so he can do whatever he wants. And it's funny to me because we will accept a million different versions of Sherlock Holmes and Watson. Literally, just, is Sherlock a mouse and Watson's a fatter mouse? Sure, okay. Hey, is Sherlock a flying eagle and he's got a canary as Watson? Okay, we'll take anything for Holmes and Watson, anything. And yet, if somebody's changing things like from Dracula, you don't like it, and other people don't like it. And I don't have a problem with that, possibly because I'm a giant Holmes fan.
I think for me, the difference is even when Holmes and Watson are mice or birds or whatever they are, they still have inherent characteristics that let us always identify that this is Holmes and this is Watson. They may have other
not read as much as I have read of Holmes and Watson. There are plenty out there where you're like, that's Holmes, really? Okay, I'm going to roll with it. In my viewing and stuff, I've seen a lot of things like that. The Great Mouse Detective or whatever. Which is exactly what I meant with the mouse.
Yeah, and the mouse. But we still had Holmes being, being brilliant Holmes, and detail-oriented, and Watson kind of like following in his wake, and and things where, and even the various human iterations of it. For me, it's Jeremy Brett all the way. But there's still. So as a fan fiction writer, and I write AUs, the characters I use still have to be quasi-identified as those characters. I can put them into space. I can have them live underground. They could be blue people like an Avatar, but there has to be a certain sense of who those characters are. Or then you're just writing original fiction. Not that fan fiction isn't, but fan fiction, you're starting with these characters, and original fiction, you're starting from scratch. So
unless you're writing in a Holmes and Watson anthology, which I've done multiple times.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. There's a lot, that's the great thing, is there's this huge range of our playpen to
see. But I looked at Mina. I looked at Mina's character as, sure, why not? Okay, she is an unwilling. She isn't happy that she's vampiric. Okay, they made it very clear that she wasn't saved in time. Okay, that's the whole thing on her. They think they saved her, but not quite. She doesn't burn up in sunlight, but she still can do a lot of the stuff. So yeah, my husband's a failure. All these people who supposedly were helping me, they're all failures, and I'm doing it on my own. So I actually liked the character a lot because I just looked at it as they said, yeah, okay, they didn't succeed. What is Mina like if they don't actually save her fully in time? And that, to me, that I could see Mina being like that without a problem. So I didn't really have issues with how they changed the characters because I've read the comics, so I already knew how Moore was changing the characters to bring them in. And it was way more upbeat than the characters and I'm going to tell you, I'm a girl who really prefers a happy ending. So it was way more upbeat than Moore's very dour and very dark. And I'm like, when does anything happy happen? Nothing ever happy happens, right? And then there's a gigantic twist at the end of the graphic novel that I cannot remember if it's in the film. But again, like Nancy said, spoilers, the League is not real. The League doesn't exist. It's made up. And that was it's made up to trap these people in some way or get, a big bad kind of thing. So it made it even more interesting in some ways because it's like, oh, this has all been a lie for all the characters. So what else is a lie? But I really didn't mind. As the person who enjoyed it, I really didn't mind.
I wonder if that's kind of the difference is that because I also didn't read the graphic novel. So I wonder if having had that, maybe I would have been more
I read the graphic
amenable
novel.
to.
I read the
this
graphic
world,
novel after the movie.
You know,
Well, I didn't read
and
any of
I
it,
don't know.
as I said, and I
Mhm.
enjoyed the movie.
Yeah, I like the movie. Yeah.
But I get irritated when comic book movies and comic book TV shows change things around from the source material unless there appears to be a really good reason for it. So I think it was probably easier for me to fall into the movie and enjoy it than it was for somebody who was as steeped in the source material.
Mhm.
But let's move on to Penny Dreadful. And Bebe, do you want to go, since you had particular things to say about that, do you want to go first or do you want to go last?
I'll dive in. So started watching the TV show from the first episode, and and loved it. I mean, Eva Green, Josh Hartnett, London Moody, but there's no downside to this, and I will fight anybody on this one. And then about halfway through the season, my husband and I used to own a company called Museum of Robots, and we did sci-fi and retro future home and personal accessories. And we were exhibiting at San Diego Comic-Con, and someone from CBS came into our booth because they own Showtime, and they're like, "Hey, hi, we have this show called Penny Dreadful. Are you guys interested in having a license to make licensed Penny Dreadful products?" And we're like, yeah. So we ended up getting, right, exactly. And so we ended up getting a license with CBS Showtime, and they cracked open the vault of wonderfulness. So what that consisted of was we got a license under housewares. Okay, Penny Dreadful housewares. What does that look like? Well, if you've seen the show, you know there are spiders. There were lots of spiders and lots of weird occulty stuff. And they gave us probably the single best licensing guidebook we've ever received. We've had a number of licenses with a number of properties that you would recognize, but Penny Dreadful was it was about 90 pages. They gave us high definition images that we could use. They had very specific ways that we could and could not use this, but they also let us come up with all kinds of ways to break every rule they had. And they had a very, very generous review board who would look at stuff because we had to submit it all for approval before we could bring it to market. And they helped us market it and blah, blah, blah. So I watched every episode of Penny Dreadful. I had memorized this 90-page book backwards and forwards. And so what we decided to do was focus on what I always think is the best of horror and sci-fi is what is it about that humans are the worst monsters, of course. And so we went right for Picture of Dorian Gray. I think nobody understood evil or stated evil better than Oscar Wilde. He just had this amazing sense of bringing out in a terse, specific way how awful people can be. And so I read again and again and again, and we pulled out a number of quotes of Oscar Wilde from, again, Picture of Dorian Gray. And we blended that with graphics and imagery and came up with a whole line of Penny Dreadful housewares and home accessories. So you could have your pillow and the spiders. And anyway, it was so much fun. And we loved it. And we had a 3-year license, and we were 2 years into it when they abruptly canceled the series without telling any of the licensees that this was going to happen. So that's how that ended. But we got to meet some of the stars at San Diego Comic-Con, and overall it was a great experience. And it gave me, I love rabbit holes anyway. Gini knows this. I love research. I love rabbit holes. This scratched every possible Penny Dreadful and all attached material. It allowed me to go deep down that rabbit hole for fun and profit. So there was no downside for this. So that's my Penny Dreadful story.
Okay.
That's pretty cool.
That is very cool.
It's fun.
Carole, how do you think Penny Dreadful, in what ways do you think Penny Dreadful does or doesn't fit into the Victorian Gothic?
I think it's fantastic. It has one of the things where Clay was talking about in terms of the society, the different roles of the society, different classes of people. You had aristocracy, near aristocracy, commons people. You had an American who was like, everyone's like, "Ooh, he's an American." Lots of course, occulty stuff, witches and Frankenstein and just all kinds of yummy stuff going on. It was gorgeous costumes, gorgeous sets. And then another element that we hadn't mentioned yet was not only was there the great interest in inventions and gadgets and all of that, but there was a great interest in foreign discovery, especially Egypt, and exploring. And that's like Alan Quatermain again, where we're exploring to these foreign lands and bringing things back and bringing concepts back, and that's a factor in there. It was just a big old delicious pile of Victorian Gothic. It wasn't necessarily foggy moody, but it had this fascination with this modern aspect of life, the supernatural, paranormal aspects. Frankenstein getting put together, and the witches, and curses and hexes, and what was the scorpion thing that she had to deal with all the time and stuff. It was really great. I won't say I was wild about the ending, but I really enjoyed the ride. And it was great to see them take their time with it. They didn't rush it. They really let you savor it as it went along. And I really liked that. Lots of not just seeing somebody change. Oh, they changed, but like the progression of that change, and what were the factors that mitigated that change, and once they changed, what was the ramifications for everyone else with the change. And so it was really fascinating on that level, as well as then the aesthetics of it, in hitting those marks of things that we consider to be characteristics of Victorian Gothic.
Okay. Clay, what did you think?
I watched the first season, and I didn't miss the second because I didn't like it, because I thought it was fantastic. It was one of those things I thought, well, I'll watch it at some point, and then that point never arrived. And I will watch it at some point when I'm 90 and when I get around to it. But I loved it. I mean, it was one of the many things my wife forced me to watch, basically, because she had watched it and she thought I would enjoy it. And she was, as usual, she was right. And Eva Green was just stunning. It was amazing. The Frankenstein monster storyline was great. In the same way as Extraordinary Gentlemen, it was this sort of shared Victorian universe that could happen because Victorianism shares many elements, but it also, unlike Moore, had original characters that were driving the story, and it really heightened the literary figures who came in because you saw them through other eyes, and the new characters, the show characters, were just as interesting and just as quirky and had just as much backstory. And yeah, I love the fact that there was slow builds on things. There were mysteries. People acted in very peculiar ways that you didn't know why, and you learned later what was going on. It was brilliantly paced. Whoever, I don't know the people who put it together, or if I ever knew, I forgot, but they clearly allowed them the time and the space and the script time to develop this. Don't know that would happen now, but it was just brilliantly paced and well edited, and it looked gory. It looked cinematic on television.
Jenny.
Well, I was here for League because even though one of my besties was doing the licensing, we go up and down in how much TV watching we were doing. And during that time, we were very down and we had no premium channels. So I couldn't see it. And I figured, We'll get around to it. That's going to go on forever. They've licensed Museum of Robots. These people intend to stay. Oh, they're gone. So I haven't seen it. Plan 2 somewhere in there. I have no idea where it's floating in the streaming verse, but somewhere along the line we'll probably get to it. But I mean, it looked good. It looked like something my husband would adore. Does not necessarily mean it's something I would like. I from a visual standpoint, no lie, I liked that League was bright and peppy. I don't really like. I do reviews of movies and for different outlets, and for one, Crimson. What was it? Not Crimson Tide. Crimson Peak came up, and I'm like, ooh, I want it. And the editor goes, Ginny, just want to make sure that you understand that this is Gothic horror, and you're not just saying it because it's Tom Hiddleston and Charlie Hunnam. And I'm like, I was just saying it because it's Tom Hiddleston and Charlie Hunnam. Please give that to somebody else because I don't want to hide under the seats. It's hard to review a movie when you're like this for half of it. So, yeah, I think my husband would love Penny Dreadful. So one of these days we'll find it.
Well, I didn't see it either, in part because to watch, it's a long story, but to watch anything for streaming, I have to watch it on my computer. And there's so many hours of the day that I want to sit at my desk, and the rest of the time I don't. And so we don't watch a lot of streaming around here. We have just a few minutes left. And I wonder if there's anything else that you all would like to recommend to people who enjoy Victorian Gothic. Crimson Peak was mentioned and by a couple of people, and there may be other things out there. It doesn't have to be a movie or a TV show. Could actually be one of those old-fashioned book things. So whatever you think. Ginny, do you have a recommendation?
Yeah, we didn't touch on it a lot, and I realize it's a classic, but The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is very, very different from any visual example. In no small part, Hyde is not some big giant monster. He's actually the small, horrible, mean little character. So, I mean, it's just really, really well done. It's a novella, so you're not putting in a long time commitment, but I really, of the ones that we didn't bring up in great detail while talking about Lee, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is really, really good.
Okay. Bebe, any suggestions?
Read Frankenstein. Just read it. Make sure you know the source material. It's like Dracula. Read Frankenstein and then watch some movies and see what abominations they can do to a beautiful piece of literature. But start with Frankenstein and run right out and buy that. I have bought and forced copies on people I like to make sure that they had that grounding. So yes, just read Frankenstein.
Okay. And Carole?
Absolutely read the original Bram Stoker Dracula. It's well-paced, it's exciting, it's moody and broody and horror-y, and it is written, a lot of it, especially the first half, is diary entries, letters, news clippings, and I love that kind of thing because it really kind of fleshes out a world. So the world building with that is really good. And then Crimson Peak was good. Atmospherically, I wasn't entirely wild about the story of it, but atmospherically and visually, it's stunning, just stunning. I did really enjoy The Woman in Black, which is Daniel Radcliffe, which, first of all, he looked amazing in this movie. And this movie is totally, we have Moors, we have an isolated little village with secrets, and everybody's behaving oddly, and we don't know why, and he's this London lawyer who's thrust into this mystery, and there's, a big old empty mansion slash, castle, whatever, on the moors amongst the fog, and ghosts, and mysterious things happening, and it's creepy, and gorgeous, and a ton of the movie is just him in this house, and it is so suspenseful. I just loved it. I just loved it. So as a movie, Woman in Black, and as a book, Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Okay. And Clay, got any suggestions?
Well, I agree with Dracula. That's a big book for me in my life. I would also recommend not mainly Gothic, but Sherlock Holmes. Read Sherlock Holmes. If you want a little Gothic, go for Hound of the Baskervilles. It's got some Gothic-y moors and fog and the footprints of a gigantic hound. It's good. I would also recommend, and I have sort of love-hate relationship with these things, but the Hammer films of the 50s and 60s, the Dracula, Christopher Lee Dracula, and which I loved when I was a kid, but don't like as much now, except for the first one, and the Peter Cushing Frankensteins, which I hated as a kid, but like better now. I like Peter Cushing anyway. All the Hammer stuff isn't great. Well, I'm not sure any of it's great, but it's a thing. It's its own thing. Watch as much of it as you can stand. It's got its own heartbeat.
Okay. And Ginny, have we come to you on this question yet?
Yeah, I was Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Okay. All right. Yes. Thank you. Well, is there anything that you would like to talk about that we have not already touched on? Anybody?
I would say just a warning. If you're going in the literature side, when you're reading, if you're not familiar with it, it's definitely a different style and a different pacing. You will get, somebody staggers in from the cold, man, give me a brandy, explains what the end is, and then goes back around and tells you the whole story. And you as a modern reader go, what? Okay, but so be prepared that the storytelling, the pacing is very different. The stories being told are very different. My personal experiences is be prepared to be very disappointed in H.G. Wells, but you need to remind yourself that his ideas were extremely original. No one had come up with this stuff before him. His execution for the day was great. For now is just like snoozer. But he was very visionary. So it's interesting to look at his stuff from that standpoint. But just be prepared if you're going in literature-wise that it's going to feel, for the most part, very different than novels from this century.
Yeah,
Well,
I actually really like Island of Dr. Moreau. I've read some other Wells and they're okay, but I love Island of Dr. Moreau. I think it's a relatively modern feeling novel. Mm-hmm. And if you like grotesqueness, got plenty of grotesque in there. So if you want a little splatter with your Victorianism, Island of Dr. Moreau.
Okay. And Carole, did you want to add something?
Well, so Clay was talking about like the Frankenstein movies and everything, the Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing and all of that. I would throw in the Roger Corman movies, definite camp factor, but he did several little Poe shorts. Several of them have Vincent Price, who is himself, a mainstay of Gothic horror. And we have the castles and the fogs and the gowns and the innocent young woman wandering around dark castle hallways with her candelabra that never goes out. and then they're flowing night dresses and things. So it's definitely campier and everything, but it's both fun and still, hits those elements, with the ghosts and the secrets and mysterious things in the basements, and I enjoy those.
Okay, and Bebe, was there anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, Clay had mentioned the pacing of Penny Dreadful and how it sort of went at a nice slow pace. Well, that's how the books were written then, because there was there was very little competition for your attention. There was no radio, no TV, no telephone, none of this. When you sat down to read a book, you sat down to read a book. I think the actual Penny Dreadful, which were broadsheet stories of horror and mayhem for, the lower yet literate classes is how they were sold. Those have probably more to do with modern pacing of stories because they were short, they were fast, they were ugly, get in, get out. There's a bad guy. There's a lot of blood. There's some screaming. There's a murder. It's solved. We're all done. So I think we need to look at different aspects of literature from the era. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Ooh, like that. Penny Dreadfuls, bam, 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 bam. We just don't see many of those out there anymore.
Yeah, good point. They're gone now.
Yeah.
Well,
So
I
as
guess
humans, we've always had short attention spans as humans. It's just a matter of finding the media that suits that, right? So, yeah.
right. And personal taste, because that's one thing the discussion illustrates, is that people have different reactions to the same things. Well, I guess that brings us to the end of the discussion. So we'll go around, and if you all will tell people where they can find information about you or your work, if you have a recent, new, or upcoming release that you would like to highlight, this would be the great time to do that. And so, Carole, will you start?
You can find me on Facebook under Carole Stokes and on a billion continual panels. As Ellis Colton, my debut novella, Prescription for Love, is up on Amazon. My second book, The Silver Dragon, will be out next month. And all of my social media links for Ellis Colton are at elliscolton.card.co. So it's elliscolton.card.co.
Okay. Clay?
You can find us at clayandsusangriffith.com, and we're on various social medias, Facebook, together and separately. We don't have anything new yet, but you can find our old Victorian Gothic, the Vampire Empire Quartet, and it's still in print and still bringing in fives of dollars every year. And the Crown and Key trilogy, which is sort of like Emily Bronte's Avengers. So you can find those.
Okay. Gini?
GiniKoch.com. I'm all over Facebook. If you want to sign up for my free newsletter, Hook Me Up, you can do so from my main fan page, Hairspray and Rock and Roll. I'm also on X, Twitter, Blue Sky, and Pinterest. And last week, my first mystery novel, co-written with Bebe Bayliss, released, and that from Gingerbread Publishing, and that is Falls Girl. You can find it everywhere.
Okay. And Bebe?
Yes, bebebayliss.com. All the traditional socials and some experimental, as some blow up and some stick. Let's see, and a number of short stories in upcoming anthologies. And yeah, the big news is the my first novel, co-written with Gini, Falls Girl, and it's a murder mystery, because who doesn't love things that are stabby?
Well, you can find me here on Continual. I'm not usually in the panel room seat. I'm usually in the Comic Slayer seat, but I do occasionally pop up on panels. My website is nancynorthcott.com. It has the various social media links on there. I do have a Facebook page. I'm not there very much. So the best way to interact with me on social media is via X, or whatever they're calling it this week. And my most recent release was Mage's Nemesis, which is a re-release of an earlier book in my Light Mage Wars Paranormal Romance series. So thank you to everyone on the panel for joining the discussion. Thank you to everyone watching. And remember, there's always more to talk about on Continual, the convention that never sleeps.